Alex Mercer had built his whole life around control. He was a man who always predicted every outcome, never letting emotions get in the way of logic. But one quiet evening at a simple restaurant, everything unraveled. The moment he heard soft crying he never expected to care, the moment he saw a child's deep blue eyes that mirrored his own, his well-planned world began to crumble. And when the woman behind the child turned around, pale and frozen, softly whispering his name like an echo from the past, Alex knew nothing would ever be the same. The little girl wasn't just a lost kid. She was his daughter, someone he never even knew existed. Alex had always thrived on control, in business, during negotiations, and in his everyday life. Everything had a plan. No surprises, no missed chances, and definitely no loose ends. That was how he had built his successful company and maintained his position. But that night, for the first time in years, he stepped away from the world of boardroom meetings and investor dinners. He craved a quiet meal away from the usual upscale places, somewhere he could be just another face in the crowd. He found himself in a modest family-run diner on the edge of town. The atmosphere was inviting, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and sizzling steak. It was the type of place where people took their time, where laughter replaced the usual hushed business chatter. The friendly waitstaff moved between tables, greeting everyone by name, and there was a warm sense of belonging in the air. Alex chose a seat by the window, ordered a steak and a glass of wine, and allowed himself a rare moment to simply relax and soak in the surroundings without the constant pressure of deadlines. Just as he was about to take his first sip of wine, a soft, trembling cry cut through the calm murmur of the diner. Looking up, he scanned the room until his eyes fell on a small figure near the counter. A little girl sitting on the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped tears away with her fists. She couldn't have been more than 4, with messy dark curls framing her round face and brilliant blue eyes that shone with sorrow. Something in Alex's chest tightened. He wasn't one to meddle in personal matters, especially not with strangers' problems. Yet there was something about the frightened girl that made him stop and help. He pushed his chair back, crossed the room in a few quick steps, and gently crouched down beside her, careful not to startle her. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked softly. The little girl sniffled, looking up with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm lost," she mumbled. Alex felt an unexpected surge of concern. He had anticipated a story about a misplaced toy or a spilled drink, not a child who was completely lost. Scanning the room for a worried parent yielded no results, and that only made him more anxious. "What's your name?" he asked in a calm tone. The girl hesitated a moment before wiping her nose with the sleeve of her small sweater. "Sophie," she replied. Alex smiled gently. "That's a lovely name, Sophie. Where's your mom?" Her lips trembled as she shook her head. "She was here, but then she left," she explained. "I thought she'd be back, but then I couldn't find her." Alex exhaled slowly, realizing that if her mom worked here, she might have just stepped away for a minute, expecting Sophie to stay put. But being a small child in a busy diner, she'd wandered off. For some reason, Alex felt compelled to help her. He could have easily called over a waitress and returned to his untouched meal, yet something in Sophie's wide, scared eyes kept him from leaving. "Does your mom work here?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "Yes, she works as a waitress." That confirmed it for Alex. He looked around and noticed several waitresses moving between tables with trays, but none were searching for a missing child. "All right, let's go find her together," he said. Sophie hesitated for a split second before slipping her tiny hand into his much larger one. The warmth of her hand surprised him. He wasn't used to holding something so small and delicate. But as they walked through the busy diner in search of her mom, Alex had no idea that this simple act would completely change his life. Alex strolled slowly, his hand securely holding Sophie's as he scanned the room. Her tiny fingers felt surprisingly fragile in his grasp, and he found himself holding on a bit tighter, as if afraid she might disappear. Sophie clung to him, her free hand gripping the hem of her sweater, while her bright blue eyes darted around the restaurant, looking for someone familiar. The more they moved, the more uncertain she became. "Do you remember where you last saw her?" Alex asked gently. Sophie paused before pointing to the far end of the diner. where a counter was lined with menus and a cash register sat waiting. She was over there, she said. Then she went to help someone with food, and I lost sight of her. Alex nodded and led her in that direction. Even though the diner was still lively, as they neared the counter, the atmosphere shifted when a frantic voice cut through the noise. Sophie! Sophie! At once, Sophie perked up, turning toward the sound. A woman rushed over, weaving quickly between the tables as if she had been searching for ages. Dressed in a simple black outfit with an apron tied around her waist and her brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, the woman's eyes widened in panic until they fell on Sophie, and then relief softened her face. Sophie's face brightened instantly. "Mommy!" Before Alex could react, the little girl let go of his hand and sprinted into her mother's arms. The woman scooped her up and held her close. "Oh my goodness, where did you go?" she said, her voice trembling as she brushed Sophie's hair and pressed a gentle kiss on her head. "I told you to stay near the counter," Sophie mumbled into her shoulder, "but then I couldn't see you, and I got scared." The woman exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for just a moment before checking Sophie's face. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Sophie shook her head. "I'm okay." Alex, who had stepped back to give them space, found himself frozen when the woman finally looked up at him. In that instant, everything shifted. He recognized those eyes. They were dark and intense, very different from Sophie's bright blue, but the shape and shock in them were unmistakably familiar. He knew her. She knew him. A heavy silence fell between them. "Alex," her voice was barely audible, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Alex felt his chest tighten. He had heard that voice in the past, but still recognized it. "Laura," he said softly. Her grip on Sophie tightened slightly, as if by instinct. Alex felt rooted to the spot, unable to think clearly because as he truly looked at her, a crushing realization hit him. Sophie, with her dark hair and blue eyes, wasn't just any little girl. She was his daughter. Alex's stomach dropped. His hands clenched into fists as he forced himself to breathe. Turning his attention back to Laura, he said, "Tell me the truth. Is she really my daughter?" Laura's breath caught, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around Sophie as if to shield her from the weight of the moment. She had imagined this moment so many times, wondered what she would say if she ever saw Alex again, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. Standing before her, Alex's broad shoulders were tense, and his blue eyes were locked on hers with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. He had always had that commanding presence, the kind that didn't need many words to demand answers. But now, there was something raw and unfiltered in his look. "Is she my daughter?" he repeated, quieter this time, but with the same undeniable urgency. Laura's heart pounded. She had always known this day would come, but she never expected it to unfold right there, in a crowded restaurant, with Sophie clinging to her. Swallowing hard and with a dry throat, Laura finally met his gaze and whispered, "Yes, she's yours." The silence that followed was heavy. Alex didn't move or speak. He just stared, his expression unreadable as he tried to process her words. Expecting anger or accusations, Laura was taken aback when all she saw was a deep hurt, almost betrayal. For years, Alex exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair as he repeated, "For years," as if saying it aloud might make it real. His eyes drifted back to Sophie, who watched them both with quiet curiosity, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice came out low and edged with pain. Laura's fingers curled slightly around Sophie's back. "Because you had your whole life ahead of you," she said, forcing a calm tone. "You were busy building an empire, making million-dollar deals, traveling the world. You were on the fast track. I didn't want to hold you back." Alex let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You never gave me the chance to decide for myself." Laura's chest tightened. "I thought I was doing what was best," she whispered. Alex's jaw clenched. "Best? You decided for me, Laura. You kept me from knowing my own daughter, from being there for her." Laura flinched, guilt heavy on her shoulders. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," she said softly. "I was scared that you'd see her as a mistake, that you'd feel trapped and resent both of us." For a moment, Neither spoke. The air was thick with unsaid emotions until Alex took a deep breath and shifted his attention back to Sophie, still cradled in Laura's arms and unaware of the turmoil around her. Alex knelt to her level and said, "Hey, Sophie," his voice now gentler. Sophie blinked at him with big blue eyes. "Hi," she replied. After a brief pause, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him, then glanced at Laura for confirmation before answering matter-of-factly. "You're the nice man who helped me." Alex exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, that's me," he said, "but I'm also someone else." Sophie's brow furrowed in curiosity. "What do you mean?" Alex swallowed hard, his throat tight as he admitted, "I'm your dad." His voice was barely above a whisper. Sophie blinked, trying to understand. She looked to Laura, then back at Alex. "Really?" He managed a small smile, even though his chest felt heavy with loss of time. Years of missed first words, steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and laughter. Sophie studied him a while longer, then smiled slightly. "Oh," she said, and to his surprise, reached out and took his hand. In that moment, Alex felt everything stop. Her tiny, warm fingers held his. And for the first time, the man who had built an empire felt that this was more important than any deal or success he'd ever had. Alex's mind raced. He knew he should be angry, demanding answers about why Laura had hidden this from him for so long. But all he could think about was the time lost, moments he would never get back. Laura's gentle voice broke the silence. "Sophie, sweetheart, why don't you go sit over there for a minute? I need to talk to Mr. Mercer." Sophie looked between them, sensing the tension, but didn't protest. She gave Alex's hand one last squeeze before skipping off to a seat at the counter. Once she was out of earshot, Alex turned to Laura, his expression hard. "We need to talk now." Laura exhaled, nodding slowly. "I know." Alex clenched his fists, his tone rough with suppressed emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. Laura looked away for a moment, arms crossing protectively over her chest. "I was scared," she admitted quietly. "I was worried that if I told you, you'd feel trapped, forced to choose between your life and a child you never expected." Alex shook his head sharply. "That wasn't your call to make, Laura. You can't decide how I should feel or erase me from my daughter's life just because you assumed I wouldn't want her." Her voice trembled slightly as she replied, "You were always busy, working long hours, traveling, building your company. I didn't think you had room for a baby." Taking a step closer, Alex's eyes burned with intensity. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have tried." Laura flinched, but kept her gaze steady. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered. Alex exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well, you weren't. You robbed me of 4 years, my chance to know her, to be there for her, and now I'm supposed to just accept that." Laura's throat tightened as she replied, "I never meant to hurt you, Alex, but you did hurt both of us." A heavy silence fell between them. Alex took another deep breath, forcing himself to look past his anger. Those lost years could never be recovered, but Sophie was still here. His voice steadied as he continued, "I'm not walking away from her, Laura." Laura swallowed hard and nodded. "I didn't expect you to, but I won't stop you." Alex searched her face for any sign of resistance, but saw only exhaustion, guilt, and maybe a bit of relief. Glancing over at the counter where Sophie was now happily swinging her legs and fiddling with a napkin like it was the most exciting thing in the world, he said, "We need to figure this out for her sake." Laura's soft reply came, "Yes, we do." For the first time that night, Alex felt like he was finally taking charge of something, not a business deal or a negotiation, but being a father. He had spent his whole life solving problems and closing big deals. Yet this was a situation with no quick fix or contract that could erase the lost time with his daughter. Sitting across from Laura in a cozy booth, he realized that some things couldn't be managed like a business transaction. Meanwhile, Sophie sat at the counter, sipping juice and blissfully unaware of the emotional storm unfolding just a few feet away. Alex leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, his tone steady despite the lingering frustration. "I need to be in her life, Laura. I don't care how we make this work. I'm not walking away from Sophie." Laura looked down at the table for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I understand," she said softly, "and I won't stand in your way." Alex studied her carefully, expecting more resistance, but her tone was calm and resigned, as if she'd finally accepted that keeping him away was no longer an option. He nodded, running his hand through his hair. "Good, because I'm not asking for permission." Laura's expression hardened for a split second before softening as she added, "I never even told her about you." Alex's jaw tightened. "Not even your name?" Laura shook her head. "A long time ago, she asked why she didn't have a dad like the other kids at daycare. I told her families come in all kinds of shapes, and that it was just the two of us. And after that, she stopped asking." Alex's chest ached. "She deserves to know the truth." "I know," Laura said, her voice cracking slightly. "But you have to understand, she's never had a father figure. It's always just been the two of us." Alex exhaled, trying to suppress the flood of emotions. "Then let's take it slow. I don't want to overwhelm her," Laura agreed hesitantly. "Okay." Alex leaned back in the booth, reflecting on how drastically everything had shifted. Just hours earlier, he'd walked into this diner expecting nothing more than a quiet meal. And now he sat across from the mother of his child, trying to figure out how to be a father to a daughter he'd never known. Laura's voice softened further as she remarked, "She really likes you, you know." Alex looked up to see her nod towards the counter where Sophie was now drawing on a napkin with a red crayon the waitress had given her. "She's usually not this comfortable with strangers, but she let you hold her hand. That's rare." A lump formed in Alex's throat as he watched Sophie concentrate, her face scrunching up as she carefully traced shapes on the paper. He didn't feel like he deserved such immediate acceptance, but he wasn't going to waste it. "I want to take her out sometime," he said after a pause. "Not right now, not tomorrow, but soon. Just me and her." Laura hesitated, then nodded. Alex exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease from his shoulder for the first time since their conversation began. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough, but it was a start, and that was all he could hope for. The next day, Alex arrived at a local park earlier than he had planned, pacing near the playground as he tried to steady his nerves. It had been 2 days since his conversation with Laura, 2 days since he'd learned he had a daughter, and everything still felt surreal. He had spent the nights awake, replaying that moment over and over, trying to understand how drastically his life had shifted in just one evening. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. After all, he had built an empire from scratch, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, and weathered pressures that would have broken most people. But this was different. This was personal. A gentle autumn breeze rustled the fallen leaves, and as Alex looked toward the park entrance, he saw Laura walking hand in hand with Sophie. His breath caught as he took them in. The way Sophie bounced with every step, excitedly chattering to her mom with her little hands waving, while Laura looked a bit reserved, her shoulders tense, as if still unsure of what lay ahead. Alex swallowed hard, determined not to let his nerves get the best of him. He had waited for this moment, even if he hadn't realized it until now. Sophie was the first to notice him. She paused mid-sentence, blinking up at him as if checking if he was still the same person from the diner. Then, with a bright smile, she said, "You're here." Tugging on Laura's hand, she broke into a run. Alex barely had time to react before she reached him, stopping just a few inches away, tilting her head up with a curious look. "Did you bring me a book?" she asked. Alex exhaled, surprised by her request, but it brought a smile to his face. "I did," he replied, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small hardcover storybook. "Your mom mentioned you love fairy tales." Sophie gasped dramatically, clutching her hands together. "I love fairy tales. Are there any dragons?" Alex knelt down to her level and nodded. "Big ones, and brave princesses who aren't afraid to fight them." Sophie grinned. "I like princesses who take on dragons. They're cooler than ones who just wait around for a prince." Alex chuckled and glanced over at Laura, who was watching with a cautious expression. He wasn't surprised at how quickly Sophie had warmed up to him. "Do you want me to read it to you?" he asked. After a brief pause, Sophie nodded excitedly. "But only if we sit on the swings. That's the best spot for a story." Alex hesitated and looked to Laura for approval. She gave a small nod, her lips pressed together as if still weighing her feelings. "Swings it is," he said, standing up. Sophie grabbed his hand without a second thought, pulling him toward the playground. Alex allowed himself to be led, amazed at how naturally she accepted him, as if he had always been part of her world. At the swings, Sophie hopped on one and motioned for him to join her on the next. Alex sat down with the book on his lap and began reading, though his focus wavered as his thoughts drifted to the little girl beside him. The way she listened so intently and trusted him without question. It was a humbling feeling unlike anything he had experienced before. Halfway through the story, Sophie gently tugged his sleeve. "You have such a nice voice," she said plainly, "just like a prince." Alex blinked, taken aback by her simple compliment. Her words stirred something deep inside him. Nearby, Laura let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "That's a first," she murmured softly. Alex smirked and turned back to Sophie. "Really think so?" she nodded solemnly. "Yep, prince, or maybe even a knight." Leaning in, Alex whispered playfully, "Knights fight dragons, you know." Sophie's eyes widened in excitement. "So, you could be one?" Alex chuckled, turning the page. "Guess we'll have to see." Laura continued to watch them, her arms crossed, but there was now a hint of warmth in her eyes, an indication that she was beginning to accept what was unfolding. They spent hours at the park, playing, talking, and reading more stories. When it was finally time to leave, Sophie ran up and wrapped her small arms around Alex's waist. He froze for a moment before returning the hug, feeling a tightness in his chest at the unexpected affection. As Laura led Sophie toward the car, the little girl glanced back and waved, "Bye, Alex." Alex laughed softly and waved back. Laura paused for a moment, then met his gaze. "That went better than I expected," he said with a nod. "Yeah, it did," she replied. There was still much to work through and many conversations yet to be had, but for the first time since everything had started, Alex felt a sense of peace. He couldn't shake the memory of the way Sophie had hugged him, a small gesture that meant the world to him. It was a moment he never anticipated, yet filled a void he had long ignored. 2 days later, Alex found himself waiting outside Laura's apartment. He shifted his weight nervously as he awaited her to open the door. Though he had been invited this time, he still felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in their world. When the door finally opened, Laura stood there, her brown eyes scanning his face with the same guarded look she always wore. But there was a softness there now. She stepped aside without a word, and Alex entered the modest yet cozy apartment. The living room was lined with bookshelves, adorned with a few framed pictures, and featured a well-worn couch that exuded comfort rather than luxury. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt like home, a home built by Laura for herself and Sophie. In the hallway, Laura mentioned softly, "Sophie's been talking about you nonstop since the park." The warmth in Alex's chest grew as he turned to look at her. "That's a good sign, right?" he asked. She nodded slowly, crossing her arms. "Yes, it is." Just then, hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. A moment later, Sophie appeared wearing a bright yellow princess dress with a slightly crooked plastic tiara on her head. She stopped in her tracks when she saw Alex, her eyes lighting up. "You came," she exclaimed. Alex smiled, crouching down slightly. "I promised I would." Sophie beamed and then spun around, lifting the skirt of her dress as she twirled. "I'm a princess today," she announced, "but not one who waits for a prince, the kind who fights dragons." Alex chuckled softly. "That's the best kind of princess there is." Sophie nodded seriously. "Mom says you're staying for dinner." Alex glanced at Laura, who was leaning casually against the kitchen counter, silently observing their interaction. "Is that okay with you?" he asked. Laura simply shrugged and replied, "It's fine." Sophie eagerly grabbed his hand and led him toward the couch. "Do you like spaghetti? Mom makes the best spaghetti." Alex allowed himself to be led, sitting down as Sophie hopped up beside him, her dress puffing out adorably. "I love spaghetti," he said with a smile. "Do I get to help in the kitchen?" Sophie gasped. "You want to help?" Alex grinned and glanced over at Laura. "I think I can manage stirring a pot," he said. Sophie giggled and leaned in as if to share a secret. "Mom doesn't like it when people mess up her kitchen." Laura rolled her eyes from across the room, adding, "Sophie, don't scare him off before he even tries." Alex laughed. feeling a warmth he hadn't known before. Sitting in their home, listening to Sophie's endless stories and watching Laura's playful exasperation, he realized this moment was real, something he had never allowed himself to desire until now. Dinner passed by easily as Sophie filled every silence with tales of school, her favorite books, and even the unique voices her stuffed animals had when she played with them. Alex listened, completely absorbed by the way her imagination worked. Every now and then, Laura would interject with a teasing remark or remind her to actually eat. After dinner, Sophie pulled out a set of crayons and some paper, setting them up on the coffee table. She began drawing with intense focus, her tongue poking out a little as she worked. Alex leaned over to see what she was making. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Sophie looked from the paper to him before proudly holding it up. It was a picture of 3 stick figures, one noticeably smaller than the others, holding hands. In the background was a house, a shining sun in the corner, and a big blue scribble that seemed to represent the sky. She pointed at each figure as she explained, "This is me, this is Mom, and this is you." Alex stared at the drawing, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say or how to feel about the fact that, in her eyes, he was already a part of their family. Laura, who had been tidying up, glanced over and smiled softly at the drawing without saying a word, letting the moment settle between them. Alex cleared his throat and finally said, "That's an amazing drawing, Sophie." She beamed and asked, "Do you like it?" Alex nodded. "I love it." Satisfied, Sophie returned to coloring the sky while Alex sat back, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his hair. He had spent his life chasing success, thinking that was all that mattered. But watching Sophie draw their little family made him realize he had been wrong. He didn't just want to be part of her life. He needed to be in it. Alex wasn't sure how long he sat there looking at the simple, crayon-drawn picture, but to him, it meant more than any accolade or business deal he had ever achieved. His name had graced magazine covers, corporate buildings, and multi-million-dollar contracts. Yet here it was, drawn next to 2 stick figures labeled Mom and Sophie, as if he'd always belonged there. Oblivious to the gravity of her art, Sophie continued coloring and humming softly. Laura moved around the apartment, cleaning up and arranging things, but every so often, Alex caught her looking at him. Not with anger or hesitation this time, but with something softer, as if she'd been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "It's getting late, Sophie," she said gently. Sophie let out a dramatic sigh, putting down her crayon as if the idea of bedtime was too much to bear. "Do I really have to?" she asked. Laura arched an eyebrow. "Do you want to be a grumpy dragon tomorrow?" Sophie thought for a moment before giving a resigned, "Fine." Alex watched as she stretched her arms and turned to him with expectant eyes. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" he asked, a bit hesitant as he glanced at Laura. Unsure of the right response and not wanting to overstep, he paused until Laura offered a small nod, silently assuring him that she wouldn't push him away. Smiling, he said, "Yeah, I'll be here." Sophie grinned and, after a brief pause, ran over to wrap her little arms around him in a tight hug. Alex was momentarily startled by the sudden embrace, but quickly returned it as Sophie pulled away and dashed off to her room. He sat for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. In just a few short days since discovering her, Sophie had already made it clear that Alex belonged. Laura leaned against the counter, watching him closely, and said quietly, "She's already attached to you. You can't just disappear." Meeting her steady gaze, Alex replied, "I'm not going anywhere." Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding and heading toward the hallway. Just before disappearing, she paused and softly said, "Good night, Alex." It was the first time she had spoken his name without any tension, without hesitation, without the barrier that had always separated them. Alex exhaled and leaned back against the couch, murmuring, "Good night, Laura," as he listened to the faint sound of Sophie giggling from her room while Laura read her a bedtime story. For the first time in years, Alex realized he wasn't chasing after something elusive. He wasn't after another deal, another success, or another number on a balance sheet. For the first time, he was exactly where he needed to be, and he wasn't about to let it slip away.